My prayer, Jehovah, hear to my entreating cry. In faithfulness give ear, in righteousness reply. No God have I but Thee. Teach me to do Thy will.
to see everybody this morning. We're going to be in 1 Samuel, if you want to go ahead and turn there. If you don't have a class book, it's the one that looks like this. Okay. For those of you who haven't been in my classes before, I use the questions in the class book more as a study aid for you. I may refer to a couple of them occasionally, but by and large, we're just going to spend the majority of our time in the text and let you, outside of it, when you're reading through it to prepare ahead for class, answer those questions to kind of hit the high points, things that I thought were important to note. And that's why some of the lessons have a lot of questions and some of them have very few questions. It's just because that's what I thought was noteworthy, and so I put it in there. Before we start off in 1 Samuel, I want to give a little bit of a overview of what's going on in the world. We're about maybe 1100, 1090. Saul starts reigning about 1040 BC. David reigns about 1000 BC, and so that's kind of where we're at. That's what we're thinking here. So what was going on in the world at that point in time? Because in a few years, we're pretty good at knowing what was going on in the world. Egypt's a big powerhouse during the reigns of the kings. Syria's a huge powerhouse. Assyria's a powerhouse. Babylon comes in. Like, we're pretty used to those ideas. But at the end of Judges and the beginning of 1 Samuel, the world is very different. At this point in time, and I've got this map up here so you can see it, this is about what the world looks like in around 1100, 1000 or so BC. Babylon is pretty much nothing. It's a city at this time, mostly subjugated by the Assyrians, occasionally not, kind of flips-flops back and forth. The Assyrians are kind of nothing at this point in time. Parthia over here has been making a lot of raids in the Mesopotamian region, and so they're kind of a powerhouse with their nomadic raiding style, but Assyria and Babylon are not. They're just nothing. A super cool thing's been going on in Egypt. For the last 200 or so years, for about half the period of the time of the Judges, Egypt has been under the control of the Amalekites. Amalek had come down into Egypt. They go by the Egyptian name Hyksos. So if you see Hyksos referenced somewhere, that's the Amalekites. That's their Egyptian name. And for about 200 or so years, they control Egypt. So right around the time of Samuel, really more right around the time of Saul, they have been kicked out of Egypt. A new dynasty has begun in Egypt. The Amalekites have been removed. They've come back to their normal lands. So Amalek is here, kind of going down below. So we're thinking about this region right over here. And Amalek has returned. Their cities are not very well supported. They don't have a massive amount of infantry really any longer. They did in Egypt, but they had a major war, so they kind of lost. Their cities are walled, but not very well walled. And so when we look at Amalek, especially in early 1 Samuel, we're going to see Saul warring against Amalek and warring against Amalek. I mean, one of the first introductions is Saul gets a bunch of men together. He walks down to the city of Amalek and he destroys the nation. Like, that's it. But for the last 200 years, they were Egypt. Like, they were the powerhouse of that southern Middle Eastern region, but not any longer. Let's talk about some of the others going on here. By the way, that means Egypt is a nothing. Nothing. The pharaohs have been ruling in the southern land of Egypt, which they called Upper Egypt because of how rivers worked in that area. So the southern region down here is, there's my pointer, where the pharaohs have been. They've just recently returned to the northern area. They're still restructuring. They're still getting things going. And so during the reign of Saul, we're not going to see anything really from Egypt. Occasionally, historically, they kind of pop in here and there. They cause a little bit of trouble, but they're really nothing. During the reigns of David or Solomon, they start to become much more important. We get into Rehoboam and following. Egypt becomes a major problem because they recover from the Amalekites' occupation. Another one we need to talk about are the Philistines. Philistia, over here in the western region of Judah, are a huge issue. The Philistines, they come from a Aegean origin, it seems to be. At least most of the ancient world believed that they did, which makes them Greek. In fact, there's a lot of similarities between how the Philistines wrote and the kind of letters that they used, and how the Greeks are writing at this point in time. Most of the ancient world calls them sea peoples. Egypt has a whole bunch of references to the sea peoples. Politically, Philistia is a powerhouse. They are in control firmly of the regions that they're in, and they have been for about 100 to 150 years. Their cities are well-manned, they have strong fortifications, but they're not a unified empire. So when we think about kings of Israel, when we talk about king of Israel, he is king of Israel. All of these tribes are united under him. He has total control over them. Philistia doesn't have that. So when we see them go to war, we're going to see a lot of references to the kings of the Philistines. 5 kings get together, or 5 cities get together, and they go off to war as a unit, because they don't have a true leader. Like, they don't have a pharaoh. They don't have an overarching king. Amalek does. Ammon does. Moab even does, to some extent. It's not nearly as strong. But Philistia does not. All right, who have I not talked about? Edom is another one. So over here, we've got the Edomites, we've got the Moabites, and we've got the Ammonites. They all are kind of stacked up on top of each other on the other side of the Jordan there. Edom comes from Esau. So we've got Amalek is also a descendant of Esau. Edom means red, and he is the descendants of Esau. They're incredibly nomadic, the Edomites are. Interestingly with them, some of the other ones, we've got more information about like religion and things like that, and they worship a lot of gods. Edom, we have very little information about what they did. They do appear to have a single god, and they called him Kos. Q-O-S is how we spell it. And he is near identical to the God of the Bible. How he talks, how he's thought of, how he rules, where his authority lies is incredibly parallel to him. One of the big differences is that he allows other gods to be worshipped as well, whereas the God of the Bible does not. And it makes perfect sense why this is. Where the Amalekites, they go down to Egypt, they become very much involved with paganism and multi-godism, whereas the Edomites do not. They stay nomadic, very much like the Israelites did. They stay under the traditions of Esau, but it devolves into a deviation from what Jacob gives to his sons. So just think about that deviation there. So they're very Jewish-like, but they are not followers of the one God. Moab is another one. Moab and Ammon both come from Lot and his daughters. So if you remember that story. Moab has some military might during this time. We've got some archaeological evidences of them pushing around. We've got some references here in 1 Samuel. We have more references in Judges, though, of the Moabites really being a problem. They don't have a centralized government like we would imagine, like the Amalekites do, or even Israel's about to get, or Egypt does. They do have a loose net government where they do have some leader, but they're just not as strong. They are mostly pastoral. They have flocks. Really, you see a few more of them into 2 Samuel when David really gets going and he starts cracking the whip against them. But Moab, by and large, they're not like Amalek or the Philistines in their might. Ammon is a weird one. Ammon did not exist until about 200 years before the time we're talking about. There's no references to him. There's nobody living there. Like they just appear on the scene. Some believe that the Ammonites had gone down into the Arabia region. So down somewhere well south, there's some references to them way down here. And then they may have come back up about 200 years before. Remember, Ammon is a son of Lot. So it's always possible that they pull a Jacob and Esau, or they pull a Abraham and Lot, and they say, this land's not big enough for the both of us, and so Moab stayed and Ammon left. It's always possible. We just have no idea. But they're very new. They have very little military might. They seem to be kind of a smaller style nation, but they're going to cause a lot of trouble for the Israelites as well. The last two I want to talk about are not on the map, but they're nations that we know about. And so I think it's kind of interesting to see what's going on in Israel compared to what's going on in the rest of the world. So Greece is going to be a powerhouse in 700 or so years. But right now they're in a period called the Dark Ages. They have just had the last of the great kings die off. Their fortifications are going to begin to crumble. They're going to begin to fall down. They're going to lose the ability to create such large walled cities. They're going to lose a lot of their literature and their ability to write during this time period. And so they're not up to the classical periods yet. When we talk about writings of Homer or something like that, we talk about the Iliad, the war at Troy. One of the reasons he writes the way he does is because he looks at these fortifications that are in ruins and he imagines what happened to them. These godlike, demigod people that made this, because they can't make it. They don't know how anymore. So Greece is in a dark age. Rome has just been settled. They're not even Rome yet. They're a hut on a hill in the middle of a swamp. Like, they are nothing in the world. And Israel is establishing itself as a kingdom. Israel is pushing out its invaders. Israel is going to exert itself until you get to the time of Solomon. And Israel's nation is going to stretch all the way up to this river, all the way down to the Wadi of Egypt. It's going to be a nation that is going to last and last and last and last and last. And Greece is going to rise, and Greece is going to fall, and Rome is going to rise, and Rome is going to fall, and that nation exists. So definitely, it's an interesting perspective, isn't it? That of all of these nations, Egypt's in a low point. The Hittite Empire has just been annihilated. The Assyrians, the Babylonians are no ones. The Persians are kind of people, but really it's Parthia that's more of the problem. And yet Israel is establishing itself. So in this historical lull, where there are no superpowers, Israel will establish itself as a superpower. I just think that's awesome. Like, you want to talk about God preparing a world for his people? This is literally God preparing a world for his people. He destroys Egypt using the Amalekites. The Amalekites get destroyed by Egypt, thereby taking out two major players in the world. The Hittite Empire just vanishes. Nobody really understands what happened to them, but they're no longer a problem. You don't have any Mesopotamian issues. All you've really got is a couple of small little nations like Philistia or Moab that are going to cause a little bit of trouble for the Israelites. But by and large, they're going to be out of the way. Anybody got any thoughts on background? I know you guys didn't get to prepare for that, but you may have a question. Into that world, we talk about 1 Samuel. So what's been going on in Israel? End of Judges is a horrible, horrible few chapters. We go from nobody really understands how to worship God to awful sexual crimes that happen a couple of times to massacres of cities, massacres of a tribe, major civil war strife going on between the tribes of Israel. They have no centralized unity. They're driven by their emotions. They're driven by catastrophes. And all they're doing is putting out fires. And in chapters 1, 2, and 3 here, but he's weak. Is there any wonder why he's weak? The world he lives in has no concern for God. Every man does what is right in his own eyes, which is a comment on paganism. Because that's what paganism is. The gods don't tell me what to do, I tell me what to do. So that's the world they live in. And so you have Eli, and you have his sons, and they're awful people. Eli's kind of presented as an okay guy, but he's awful. Like, he's weak, he's pathetic, he has no backbone whatsoever. He does not stand up for God in any way, shape, or form, beyond the fact that he gives house to a small boy whose mom randomly decides to give him to him. Like, it's a very weird story. All right. Anybody got any thoughts before we get into chapter 1? Okay. I did realize I have a typo on the very first page of my class book. I don't know how many of you guys caught it, but the first lesson is supposed to be chapters 1 through 3. I did some reworking to get me down to 12 lessons instead of 13 lessons because I only get 12 weeks in this quarter, and I didn't change that. So if you didn't go into chapter 3, that's fine. I'll go into chapter 3 for you. If you just got your class book here today, No harm, no foul. The next one's correct. Okay. Chapter 1. In chapter 1, we're introduced to a man. His name is Elkanah. Elkanah, it tells us, is of a city called Ramathaim Zophim. Later, it's going to be called Ramah. I'm much more happy with Ramah because that's a lot easier for me to say. And he is of the hill country of Ephraim. We're given a little bit of his lineage. Elkanah, the son of Joraham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph. He is an Ephrathite. Now, there is a little bit of controversy on if he is a Levite or not. If you guys want to turn over to 1 Chronicles with me. And we'll look in chapter 6, 1 Chronicles 6. As the chronicle writer is listing off the sons of Levi, he gets over here into verse 33. And in verse 33, these are the men who served and their sons. Of the sons of Kohath, you have Heman, the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Samuel, the son of Elkanah, the son of Joraham, son of Eliel, son of Toah, son of Zuph, son of Elkanah, and so forth and so on. And if you compare that with the list in 1 Samuel, it's pretty similar. Son of Jehoram, son of Elihu. You get over here and you look in verse 34 of 1 Chronicles, you have Joram, son of Eliel. Okay, that's pretty close. Son of Toah. That's not in, it's called Tohu in 1 Samuel. Son of Zuph. Zuph gets over there. I don't know if it's the same guy. I'm just going to be frank. I just don't know. It's possible that in 1 Chronicles, the list here is trying to say Samuel is a Levite. Specifically, he is a Levite of the Kohath family, which allows him to function, but not really as priest because he's not a son of Aaron. It's possible. It is also interesting to me that in 1 Chronicles, we have a repeat. We've got Elkanah, the son of Joram, the son of Eliel, son of Toah, son of Zuph, son of Elkanah, son of Mahath, son of Amasa, son of Elkanah, son of Joel, these names just keep repeating themselves. So just in this one little section, Elkanah is mentioned, 3 times? Joel's mentioned at least twice. So it's possible that these are just common names, it is. It's also possible that Samuel is a Levite rather than of Ephraim. That's also possible too. I don't really know. I don't know enough to say one way or the other. I tend to lean on the side that he's not a Levite just because it makes him weirder. And Samuel is weird enough as it is, but it just continues to add to the mysticalness of Samuel himself, that he doesn't really fit any mold whatsoever. He is a Moses figure, he is a Jesus figure, and stands seemingly outside of the norm. So him not being a Levite would even add to his not the norm. Moses offers sacrifices and is not a son of Aaron. Samuel offers sacrifices and is not a son of Aaron. Jesus offers a sacrifice and he's not a son of Aaron. And so these figures are just very stand out. Major changes happen with these 3. So that's kind of where I land. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Okay. Elkanah has a problem. Well, Elkanah doesn't really have a problem. Elkanah has a problem only because his wives have a problem. What is the problem that the wives have? It's in verse 2. Exactly. One has children, but Hannah has none. So we've got Peninnah, and Peninnah is cruel. Peninnah is not nice. Peninnah causes problems for Hannah because if you are a woman in the ancient world and you can't produce children, why feed you? That's literally where it comes down to. Why do I continue to provide support for you? You're useless to me. Elkanah tries to comfort her occasionally. We see that a little bit. In verse 5, he gives her a double portion because he loves her, but it doesn't really matter to Hannah. It just doesn't. If your sole reason for existence has been removed from you, you can imagine the kind of depression you would feel. The kind of anxiety every time that you think you might be pregnant and then find out that you're not. That worry, that fear, that self-loathing that she feels year after year after year. And then she has to live with a woman, as verse 6 says, her rival used to provoke her grievously. to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. Note the perspective as well here. The Lord had closed her womb. Here in the first 3 chapters, we're going to see that quite a bit. All through 1 Samuel, we're going to see God doing things. God is incredibly active in 1 Samuel. God is making people do things. He's keeping people from doing things. He's changing their thoughts. He's interacting with them physically. He is a true, powerful, active God in 1 Samuel. And this is the first place. Why has he closed her womb? Because he's about to do something spectacular. That's why. It's Abraham and Sarah. It's Mary with Jesus. I mean, like a spectacular event is about to occur here. And so to make it noteworthy, it's like Samson and his parents. To make it more noteworthy, we're going to have a weird event, be barren for a long time, and then have a massive figure come onto the scene. And then she's going to have more kids, and she's going to go on, and everything's going to be great. But to really emphasize the importance of Samuel, God makes her wait. Any comments? So the story continues down in verse 9. They go down to Shiloh. They're down there to do their sacrifices. This seems to be where the tabernacle is. Later on, when David starts to come in, Shiloh is still going to be kind of important, but it almost sounds like an actual house instead of the tabernacle at that point. We'll talk about it when we get there in a few weeks. But they get down to Shiloh, and it tells us in verse 9, Hannah rises up, and she goes to the temple itself, the tabernacle itself, and Eli the priest is sitting on his normal seat by the doorpost of the temple. It calls it temple here in ESV, probably because it's being written after the temple is made, and so they're thinking of it that way, but it's the tabernacle at this point. She is deeply distressed in verse 10, and she prays to the Lord, and she weeps bitterly, and she vows a vow. She says, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Okay, there's a few things in her vow that I do want to highlight here. First of all, she calls him Lord of hosts. At this point in time, Lord of hosts means something slightly different than it's going to mean later on. So once we get into like the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lord of hosts starts to mean Lord of an angelic host. At this point in time, when you're reading through Leviticus, you're reading through Numbers, you're reading through Deuteronomy, into Joshua, when it's called the Lord of hosts, it means Lord of a lot of Israelites. That's really what it's emphasizing. Lord of a vast amount of people, not just a Lord of angelic people. So once we get into the major and the minor prophets, that's going to kind of take a shift. She says, Lord of all of us, if you will look on me and you will give me a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. No razor shall touch his head. By her saying no razor shall touch his head, what kind of a vow do we assume she's making on behalf of her son? A Nazirite vow. It's fairly safe to make that assumption. She doesn't mention anything about wine, and she doesn't mention anything about not killing people or touching dead things. She doesn't talk any about that. But it's a very much a Samson-esque vow where the parents are making the vow on behalf of the child, and the child has to be that way for the rest of his existence. Seemingly he does. Like, there's no indication anywhere down the road whether this is done or not. Like, nobody ever says, you know that Samuel, that guy with hair touching the ground? Like, nobody ever mentions that. By the way, I don't think I have ever seen a picture of Samuel written in the last 100 years, drawn in the last 100 years that has hair down to his ankles. But if he keeps the vow his mom made, his hair should be incredibly long, probably up in a bun of some sort, and his turban be like this big. Anyways, side notes. Okay, so she makes this vow. While she's making the vow, in verse 12, Eli sees her, and he sees her in a weird way. How is she praying? Silently, but her mouth is moving. And so what does Eli assume? She's drunk. Okay, let's just talk about that for just a moment. If you guys came here to the assembly every Sunday morning, and you see somebody standing off in the corner, and they're kind of mouthing to themselves, would you assume they're drunk? No. You might assume they're having a problem. You might even assume there's a Bluetooth in their ear. I mean, you might assume a whole host of things. But drunk is not the one, because we're here to worship God. And yet, when they came to the tabernacle, it must have been so common that that's his immediate response is, oh, she's a drunkard. This is how God is worshipped. This is the tabernacle. This is the level of worship that Eli has allowed to exist. That it's assumed if somebody behaves a little bit weird and they're at the tabernacle, they're drunk. How many other drunk people are around? Well, we know at least his sons are there, so that's two. Anyways. So they go on. Hannah is speaking in her heart. Her lips are moving. Her voice is not heard. Eli sees her, and he yells at her, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you." And she's like, "I'm not drunk. I'm just real upset. I've poured out my soul before God. Don't think of me," in verse 16, "as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." Let's talk about that phrase, worthless woman, for a moment. Anybody have anything different? Wicked woman. When we see it with men, a lot of times this will be translated as son of Belial. King James really liked that one, if I remember right, because the word is Belial. But what it means is worthlessness, wickedness, emptiness, vainness, a person of no substance whatsoever. They are just an empty shell of nothing. And she says, don't think of me that way. This is a pretty common thing through 1 Samuel. We even see it a little bit in Judges. Must have been just a common insult, like just they said, "Oh, he's just a worthless person. He's just a wicked person. He's just empty inside." And it must have been incredibly common because we see it all over the place through 1 Samuel. But she says, "I'm not one of those kind of people." It might even be like a sub-religious movement. It's always possible. "I'm not one of them. I'm speaking because I needed God to hear me." And Eli says, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And she says, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." And she goes on her way. She eats. Her face is no longer sad. That's huge, isn't it? How many years do you think she did ask God for a child? I guarantee you it's pretty frequent. But something changed in this encounter. God does not enter in. She doesn't see a vision. She doesn't see some massive miracle. She doesn't get a warm and fuzzy feeling from the Lord. But something changed for her in this interaction with Eli that made her go away, and her face is no longer sad. She has a confidence now that for some reason didn't exist before. Any thoughts before we go a little further? They rise. They go home. A little while later, she gives birth to a son, Samuel, for she says, "I have asked for him of the Lord." Okay, so for a few years, Elkanah goes down, and he does his sacrifices. She remains back at home because she wants to wean the child before giving him over to Eli, because let's just say, Eli is not the greatest of dads, so you need to do as much parenting as possible before you give him over. And I know a lot of it has to do with food. And so she waits a few years before finally presenting him to Eli. She leaves him there. In verse 24, she brings a sacrifice. What kind of a sacrifice does she bring? What animal? We'll go with that. A 3-year-old bull. Now, if you think back to last year, when I went through Leviticus, everybody scrub out those memories. What kind of a sacrifice do you think she's about to offer? She brings a 3-year-old bull. She brings an ephah of flour and a skin of wine. What sacrifices? What are her options here? Don't make us go back to Leviticus. It's definitely free will. But there's a few options for free will. It could be a peace offering, free will. It could be a burnt offering that is free will. Those are both options here. What's another one? We're starting to move towards perhaps even a sin offering. The 3-year-old trips us a little bit with that. But some of the concepts of what's going on here could lend itself to that region as well. But it's probably a peace offering or a burnt offering. You were on the right track. So this is either going to be an only for God meal. Remember, that's the way the sacrifices are thought of. I'm going to put my bull on the altar, and God will eat it. That's a burnt offering. Or it's going to be a communal meal, and I am going to bring my bull to the Lord. We're going to put part of it on the altar. God will eat that. We're going to give part of it to the priest. The priest will eat that, and I will take part of it home, and I will eat that. Therefore, we are all communing together and sharing a communal meal. I lend more towards the peace offering style because I think what she's doing with God really hits home with that concept. That she is making an agreement here with God, and to seal the agreement, to seal the giving of the child, they sat down and they ate together. Any comments? Cool. All right, where are we at? In chapter 2, Hannah prays. We don't tend to talk a lot about her prayer, so I do want to read it and then move a little longer into chapter 2, but we'll probably not get to chapter 3 today. Hannah prays and she says, "My heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread. Those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord will be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Let's talk a little about this prayer. First of all, I do wonder if this was prayed out loud. And if it was, I really hope Peninnah was nearby. Did you catch that? Especially the first 5 or 6 verses. Whoa. You want to talk about jabbing her every single line that she can? I mean, just think about it. My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like you. In verse 3, talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge. By him his actions are weighed. The powerful are broken. The ones with many children are thrown down. The ones who are full are thrown down. Yeah, this is a prayer of, ha! God loves me. He's not going to love you so much anymore. Yeah, very, very much so. She is exalting in the fact that God has shown her favor. And by this, we kind of get an impression that God has shown disfavor now to Peninnah in comparison with Hannah. Any comments anybody has? Sometimes I think we forget that the people in the Bible are pretty much just like us. How would you feel if for years you have been barren, your purpose of existence has been taken from you, you're in the pits of despair, and every single day a woman comes in and jabs at you with every single word and every single action that she has, and then finally you get up over her? How are you going to feel about this? Yeah, you're going to be exultant. I guarantee you there's going to be more than just these words that were said. Like, just hugely exultant. And if she was sarcastic, it would be even better. So much better. All right, let's go on past the prayer of Hannah. Yeah.
I think her prayer of thanksgiving here makes it pretty clear what the answer to Elkanah's thoughtless question in verse 8 is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we've set the stage. Elkanah and Samuel and Hannah are kind of set aside for a moment because we're setting up for a hero. But in the meantime, we need to know why we need a hero. Why do we need this outside of the norm man to suddenly arise, like we did all through the rest of Judges? Why do we need him? Well, the answer is the end of chapter 2, where from verse 12 all the way through the end, really into chapter 3, we find out why a hero is needed. The sons of Eli were worthless men. This is where son of Belial frequently comes in. They did not know the Lord. Let's just think about that verse, just that one, for just a moment. They were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. What is their job? What are they supposed to be doing in life? Offering sacrifices. How in the world can you offer a sacrifice to God if you don't even know God? How in the world? Like, you just can't. You want to talk about everybody doing what's right in their own eyes? This is the result of a religion deciding that they're going to deviate from what has been codified and written, and choosing instead to start allowing other ideas and be okay with other things. This is the result. You have a rulership, a religious rulership, that does not know what the God they're following even wants from them. Not a clue. One of them is going to be the next high priest. How awful is that? And again, Eli is not presented terribly in Scripture. God yells at him, yes. But he's not presented like his sons are. He's not described as a man who goes out drinking. He's not described as a man who goes carousing. But he's awful to produce two sons like this. Yes?
Do you think Elkanah was considered a faithful man? Or was he a person who was just going through the motions?
Elkanah or Eli?
Elkanah. Because his wife seemed to be the person that sort of turned things.
It's a really interesting question. And it's one that I'm going to pause on answering, because I think this section from 12 down through verse 17 gives us some clues into answering your question. Because your question really is not necessarily is Elkanah righteous, but how can the normal people be righteous if their leadership is not? That's really where the question is. And notice the interaction from 12 down through verse 17 of the priesthood with the normals. So, first off, we start in verse 13. The custom of the priest with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servants would come. While the meat was boiling, with a three-pronged fork in his hand, he would thrust it into the pan or the kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Okay, point number one of the sinfulness of the priesthood is that they are incorrectly eating from their sacrifices. So, Leviticus is pretty clear. Leviticus 8, 2 Chronicles 35, both talk about this, where you have a portion that is yours, priests. Their portion is specific, and it's codified in the law of God. They get, I think it's the right shoulder, and they get one of the flanks. Like, that's it. It doesn't matter whether you want a different portion or not. Doesn't matter. That is yours, but the offerer has his own. He is supposed to boil it before leaving tabernacle grounds. So what are they doing here? We've got a person who has come to offer a sacrifice. He has brought his sacrifice. He has put the appropriate things on the altar. He has probably already given the appropriate portion to the priest. And then he is doing exactly what he's supposed to do by boiling the rest of it right here. And the priest comes and says, I want a little more. So, to answer your question from his first example, I think the normal people are more righteous and know more about God than the priests do. Because they're following the steps, even though the priests are not. If they were truly as ignorant as the priests are, I don't think we would see it presented this way. I think it would be presented much more like an offerer came, he gave a bunch of stuff to the priests, and everybody had a great time and they all got drunk. But they don't. The offerer is presented as righteous in this first example. He is doing what he's supposed to. Look at the second example, though. The second example is even clearer. In verse 15, moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. If the man says to him, let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish, he would say, no, but you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force. Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Second example is even clearer, isn't it? The offerer knows God wants all of the fat. Leviticus 3, Leviticus 7, it's very clear. You can eat no fat, all the fat is mine. How do you get rid of the fat? You scrape it off of certain things, like the organs, you scrape it off and make sure it goes onto the altar. And the rest of it you just put on there. When the fat is burned, you take the meat off. And then you divvy it up, then you do your boiling, then you give to the priest, then you do the rest of the stuff. The offerer knows this. And so by extension, I assume Elkanah does. And by the standard of his day, he is much more righteous than the priesthood. Because that is how they're presented. Even notice the offerer argues for righteousness. He says, hold on, let me do the God portion first, and then you can take whatever you want. He's already making an exception here. This is going back into Judges. Don't come in and rape this man, take my concubine instead. It's still wrong, but it's better wrong, if you can understand the difference. That's his perspective. What is the man giving up? The man's giving up his own portion. He's not giving up God's portion. And he's okay with that. But the priest won't take it. Their servant even goes so far as to say, no, if you do not give it to me, I will take it by force. This is God's representatives on earth. Remember when we went through Leviticus, the high priest is God on earth. That's how he dresses, that's how he's presented, that's how he's treated. He is literally God. So that when you interact with him, you're interacting with God. His priesthood is God's representatives. And they're just worthless. Yeah.
Record doesn't specifically condemn Eli. The onus is always on dad in the Old Testament to teach the children.
Yeah.
And I think the record of his sons would have been damning enough, especially to an Old Testament style audience. They would, we tend to see that as mom's failure when the kids act up. They would have seen that as dad's failure. Yeah. And I'm jumping ahead a little, even into 22 and following. Eli says, well, I'm hearing about these things that where are you, Eli? Yeah. You're supposed to be in charge here. What's going on that you are having to hear about this from other people?
Yeah, and let's go into that. Verse 22, Eli's very old. He kept hearing all the sons of it were doing to all of Israel, how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Hannah first meets Eli, where is Eli sitting? In the door to the tent of meeting. Where are Eli's sons sleeping with these women? Okay. Assuming he has poor vision, you don't have that poor a vision that you can't see 20 feet in front of you. Or assuming he's a little hard of hearing, which scriptures don't really talk about. They talk more about his vision being darkened. You're not that hard of hearing. Like, come on, man. Yeah, Eli's specific sins are not really talked about. His sin, according to God, is the failure of being a father. That is his failing. It's also very interesting to me that we have Elkanah, who the only thing we know about him is that he's kind of an obtuse man. Like, that's about it. But Hannah is a righteous powerhouse. Like, she is totally devoted to God in everything that she is. And then we have Eli, God's high priest. who is purely corrupt, seems to love God, but I don't really think he even knows who God is. Like, I really don't. I think he has some weird concept of God, but I don't think he really even knows what God wants from him. Because otherwise, he would do some of it. Because God's pretty specific. Yeah.
Because of his lineage. Yeah. Yeah.
Though even that's an interesting question. He is of the fourth son of Aaron, and nobody really knows why it skipped to the fourth son. So Aaron, and then his old, or I think his third one, I think is the next one. I think the top two die. The third one then becomes, but nobody really knows why it doesn't go to his son. It went to Eli's lineage instead. So we don't really know. But for some reason it does. Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. And just to kind of look at the foreshadowing, that's a good question of why Saul is rejected as king compared to David. Eli is chosen because he fits the bill. He's the right family. Saul is chosen because he fits the bill. He looks like a king. But both of them are going to be rejected in favor of a family that will devote themselves to God. Yeah. 27 down to 36, God speaks with Eli through a man of God, through a prophet, and just tears him up and down. Verse 29, why do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Who is eating the incorrect offerings? Eli is. Yeah, he is reaping the benefit of his son's wickedness. Therefore, God promises in verse 30, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me, I will lightly esteem. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so there will not be an old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I will not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. This that shall come upon you, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house. He shall go in and out before my anointed forever. Everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places that I may eat a morsel of bread. This is the prophecy given to Eli. You're done. Your father's house is done. Your children's house is done. None of your men will ever become old again. They're going to die long before that. And this is how you're going to know what's going to happen. Both of your sons will die on the same day. And then we have 35 and 36. And I got like 2 minutes left, and that's what I want to talk about. In 35, he says, I will raise up for me a priest, a faithful priest, who will do what is according to my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house. He shall go in and out before my anointed forever. Who is the first fulfillment of this prophecy? Samuel, who may or may not be a Levite, and is certainly not of the family of Aaron. So you want to talk about either side of that. Whether you take the fact he's a Levite or you take the fact that he's an Ephraimite, he should not be a priest. Done. End of story. And in verse 36, everyone who is left of your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and say, please put me in one of the priest's places that I may eat a morsel of bread. This, I think, deviates from Samuel. Samuel is never portrayed in 1 Samuel as someone who works at the tabernacle after his childhood. Never again. He lives in Ramah for the majority of Saul's reign. He goes back and forth. He offers sacrifices on high places. The one place he does not go back and offer sacrifices is the tabernacle. It kind of fades into nothingness until the time of David, when it seems to be more of a house, like an actual structure, than the tent itself. So something seems to have happened with it. But these two verses, 35 and 36, are really fulfilled in Jesus, not Samuel. Samuel hardly even really fits the bill for these two prophecies. Samuel does not offer to the sons of Eli places in the priest's place. He does not stand and going in and out before the anointed forever. His house is not established. It's gone after he dies. And we just never hear of it again. But if we take a look at this as looking forward to the Messiah, then we can see its fulfillment. Jesus will be a priest who is faithful. He will do all that is in the mind of God. He will be given a sure house that will never fade away. He will be the one that all will come to and say, please give me a portion in that house. All right, next time we'll get into chapter 3 and start on to lesson 2. Be ready for that. Thank you very much.